it's a great pleasure to be here with Jennifer Koh and to have an hour or so to talk about Beethoven and all of these things. And we will try to leave some time for questions so that you all can raise issues that you might have. And we were talking on the way over. I was telling Jennifer about a cartoon that was published a year or two or so ago, in which you see about 4 or 5 London bobbies, and they are dressed in riot gear, and they have their clubs raised, and they're marching, and they're marching. And the byline at the bottom says, "We heard you were performing Beethoven sonatas without using an Urtext edition." Now, Urtext edition, for those of you who don't know what it is, I happen to have them here, would be the original Beethoven, what he originally wrote. And the idea in classical music is, you know, whether you're playing Bach or Beethoven or whatever, you don't dare mess with the text. The text is given, and scholars spend an awful lot of time fussing about, is this a quarter note or an eighth note? Does the slur go to the third note or the second note? Is this an accent, or is this actually a crescendo in case of Schubert, and so forth? I bring this up because we tend to think of classical music, or some people in the press think of it as dying. It's music for a kind of elitist audience. Sometimes at the worst, it's viewed as museum music, old music. You know, why should we care about it? What relevance does it have to us? And as classical musicians and people who care about music, it's sort of our job to bring it to life and find new ways to get at it. And what Jennifer has done and is doing is she's conceived this very wonderful and beautiful project by which she takes the 10 violin sonatas of Beethoven and adds to them commissions of new works by modern composers. So these are interwoven into her performances of the 10 sonatas, which she's doing along with everything else. I simply don't know how she does all of this. I mean, the list of violin concertos you're doing, and you're doing the 10 sonatas, and it's amazing. I see why the biography is so long, but it's truly extraordinary. So what we'll start off by is just exploring a little bit of your project, and maybe you could say a few words about how you envision this and how it is meeting your expectations, and how you are using contemporary music as a kind of new lens to get into Beethoven, you know, whom we all thought we knew so well, but we're discovering that, you know, there's always more to know about Beethoven.
Well, I think the idea initially came because I think Shai and I felt that we were ready to perform the 10 Beethoven sonatas. I think simultaneously, I went to a production of Julius Caesar at BAM, which was by the Royal Shakespeare Company. And of course, I was an English major, so I'd studied this play. And historically, you know, speaking, I think the way that we often conceive of Caesar is, Julius Caesar, is that he was a heroic, somewhat tragic Western military leader and figurehead, right? So what was really fascinating to me, and I also got that feeling from reading the play, that was part of the impression. What was fascinating about this particular production was they set it in Africa. So Julius Caesar was kind of set as this kind of military despotic leader. And the amount of sympathy in that production that I suddenly had for Marcus Brutus was unbelievable. And I realized that all of us hold assumptions within ourselves. And that if that kind of issue had been brought up, let's say by either MSNBC or Fox News, it would have been incredibly, it would have, you know, continued the stratification on both sides and contentious behavior on both sides, right? But when it's done, when it challenges our assumptions within the lens of art and through experience, it really shifts your idea one's idea. It shifted because I would have never, of course, gone into the production saying, I am racist. But I realized, having come out of observing that I came into that production with very specific assumptions. Julius Caesar, seen as a white figurehead, was seen as heroic. You put the setting in Africa, he immediately became a despotic, military leader, junta leader or something. And it challenged my own assumptions that I hold within myself. Now, simultaneously at the same time, Shai and I had been talking about doing the Beethoven sonatas. I had brought it up with some people that I go to, kind of advisors, and people I work with, and they all immediately said it was a horrible idea. And that was interesting to me, right? Because when I'd gone to them 6 years prior to that about Bach and beyond, they said that was a horrible idea because I was known for contemporary music. And a few years before that, when I had approached them about contemporary music, they were like, that's a horrible idea. You're known as the Tchaikovsky winner. And I was like, hey, you know what? I bet if I was a German violinist, you would have said this was the most natural project ever for me to do. And you know what? They actually sat back and they said, you're absolutely right. So one of the challenges I think that we have within classical music is that in order to not become a museum piece, I think we have to constantly challenge these ideas that we have. And this is also within, I think, with our own colleagues and within the music world, that it's not about, oh, this is the next Josh Bell, this is the next whatever, Horzhowski. Okay, that's like a little, I have to find a more, or whatever, because I think that that's what we usually look for, is who is the next model of something that we're used to. So Bridge to Beethoven was really about trying to come to a realization that the art form itself is not dead. Classical music is not dead, but how do we put it into a context where you see the revolutionary aspect of the art form itself, of the music itself, of Beethoven, and how do you make it relevant? And at the same time, how do we address this idea of making a new model? That it's not just our assumption. And this was confronting my own assumptions, right? That I see a military figure like Julius Caesar, but then I see somebody like Genghis Khan, and I'm like, oh, that's a terrible military leader, those are savages, those are despotic leaders. So we have all of these assumptions that we kind of have held within us. So, and I think one of the great things about art is that you are able to create experience that people don't have on a daily basis. So whether you categorize that as empathy or whether you read a novel and you can identify and come to an understanding of character, even as, let's say Anna Karenina, you might not be a woman, you might not be having an affair, but you can sympathize with her experience. And art has that ability. So music has the ability to take people out of their daily experience, their daily emotional experience, and bring them to a place that they don't feel that necessarily on a daily basis. So Bridge to Beethoven was in many aspects kind of a confrontation of that kind of space that I believe we exist in. And it was about exploring this idea of where is this art form going? I think the greatest artists within classical music are the most curious. Whether it's somebody modern like Ligeti, who uses, ocarinas, and or Kortag, who uses those like soccer stadium things that are like now banned because they're so loud. And these are, or even Mozart with this Turkish craze, you know, and trying to integrate these musical elements. So you see the greatest artists in this field. I'm just limiting it right now to classical music, but you could go, you know, to visual arts and say Picasso with African masks, or you could say Van Gogh with Japanese arts, or whatever, with Japanese prints. So I think a place of coming to an understanding of different experiences and people that come from different experiences can often be accessed in a very personal way through the experience of art. So, you know, the way that I approached each of these composers was kind of telling them that this was a place of the different issues that I wanted to address. You know, I think on the most obvious musical kind of content, it was about how do we have a modern lens into this music? Mm-hmm. How do we show the revolutionary musical aspects of Beethoven through putting it through the lens of a contemporary work? But it was also more than that. It was how does this art form evolve to be more inclusive? Because the art form itself, music, is an incredibly visceral and human experience. I don't think I know a single mother that hasn't sung something to their child, or a single parent. There's something very elemental about music, I think, as a way to communicate between human beings. So it's about returning to that elemental sense of what music is. But understanding that it is universal. The art form itself is incredibly universal. And how do we exclude people from this form? Maybe without consciously doing it. So, for example, the piece by Vijay is called Bridge Tower Fantasy. And it's, you know, written in homage to Bridge Tower, for whom the Kreutzer Sonata was originally written. And he was half African. And he integrated musically West African rhythms, also elements of the Kreutzer Sonata, also the fact that Bridge Tower in written documents improvised on top of the variations in the Kreutzer Sonata, and that Beethoven loved it and said, oh, you should do this again. Like literally, like repeat it right now in the concert. But he's kind of been written out of history. I don't know that every audience member knows that the Kreutzer Sonata was written for a man of color, a performer of color, that we even recognize that there were performers of color in that time. So this is something I believe that it's done quite a bit in academia. And I can definitely say, having been a college graduate, that you do approach literature through a post-colonialist lens, whether you're reading Jane Eyre, and you approach it through a feminist lens. You approach it through a Marxist lens about class, in that time period, through deconstructualists, how do they use language? Who's kind of strategically higher as a character through their use of language? Or Lacan, there are numerous ways, right? But we don't do that in performance with music. So I wanted to think of a way to bring that experience into the performance hall and make it a public shared experience. And so that was a very long answer, but that's wonderful. How Bridge to Beethoven came into being. Yeah. And I will also say that so our composers are of a variety of different races, including myself. And each composer approached the subject matter in very different ways.
Mm-hmm. So, getting back to this idea that we're text and that one doesn't dare separate from it. So what you are doing, in effect, is creating a new creative space between these sonatas. You're opening up new perspectives so that they enter into a kind of dialogue with one another. And the dialogue is now extending from the 19th century into the 21st. People have been talking about the demise of classical music since at least the 1920s, and it's always coming up, classical music is dying, fewer audiences are going, and so forth. But the thing of it is, take a piece like the Beethoven Fifth Symphony. It was premiered in December of 1808 in Vienna on an extraordinary concert. If you were there at that time, you got to hear the world premiere of the Fifth Symphony and the Pastoral Symphony of Beethoven, also the choral Fantasia. But those pieces have been around, you know, a couple hundred years. And so they have staying power. They have meant a lot to many, many generations. And I think what happens is that every generation, every successive generation, brings to Beethoven, or if it's Bach or what it may be, the other arts, their own needs, their own expectations, and they devise their own interpretations of this music. If the music is truly timeless and great, and if it's going to last, if it's going to say something to us, it has to have that power. And so what we find is that some generations might really be into, you know, middle period Beethoven, the Fifth Symphony, and you know, the Waldstein and the Passionata. Others might be into the late Beethoven, the sort of transcendental style. Still others might be curious about the early Beethoven when he's very close to Haydn and Mozart. But every generation has its own needs. And what you're doing is you're reminding us that this music has relevance to where we are today, and that these pieces, these 10 weighty sonatas, which form this imposing cycle, do present possibilities for opening up a kind of artistic license and a kind of freedom, first by virtue of commissioning these new works. But second, I would suspect that then in turn probably has an impact on how you perform the sonatas themselves. You're probably thinking about these commissions as you approach the Kreutzer or the Opus 96 or whatever it may be. I would think that there's spillover between, right? They're not watertight.
No. Well, let me first address your question, because I believe I grew up in a generation where as soon as I started in music, people were declaring the art form that I loved and found to be a great conduit for communication, yes, to be dead. And so from the beginning, very beginning, I question every single day, is classical music dead? How do we show that it's not dead? Why is it not dead to me? What elements of this art form is so alive to me? Right. And a big part of that for me was programming, and a big part of that became contemporary music, and literally became. I mean, now I've formed a nonprofit. The idea of how do we show our communities that we are of service to them? That's another long story, but you know, the artistic community, I think in a lot of ways we really do support each other, and they're very generous people within this arts community. And so it's really about kind of communicating to the general public what we do, what is the purpose of this art form that we're in. And partly you can do it by programming, partly you can do it literally, that it's actually our responsibility to communicate what we do for how we serve our communities. But yes, in terms of, I will address the musical question, which was how, you know, what I hope most of all is that it changes how we experience Beethoven. Because I think, you know, the only way that classical music can become a museum piece is if it's just a reproduction of what you thought you knew before, right? There's no point of going to a museum, right, or to the Louvre and seeing the Mona Lisa. We have 1 million reproductions on postcards, on posters, in books, and blah blah blah. Unless you can see something different in it, right, in person. So why would you not stay at home and just listen to your recording of the Kreutzer Sonata? Why would you go to a live experience? So there's several. I think, at least for me, I have several beliefs about it. One, which is shared experience, and being in a place where you can actually be absolutely present. I know most of the time I'm like on the phone, texting and doing email, and also like talking on the phone at the same time, which is awful. And so when is there a point where you can just absolutely be present, and absolutely be present with a community of people and have a communal experience? I think that's what's very special about live performance. And I think we as musicians and also people in the music business. It's about offering that experience. Okay, so, but specifically about the program, you know, what I hope with most of the programs I do is that people will be able to hear Beethoven in a different way with Bridge to Beethoven, that they'll hear the revolutionary aspects because they'll hear it through a contemporary lens of a composer. For example, here we did Vijay Iyer's piece. And he added different elements, but at the same time, there were revolutionary aspects within his own piece. But it took it took motivic material from the Kreutzer Sonata. So hopefully, the audience will then hear the Kreutzer in a different way. And so that's kind of the idea, because we're always bookending in these programs. And I've done this also with Bach and Beyond, where it's always bookended, because I want people to go through this journey of hearing a composer that they thought that they knew, hearing a new work juxtaposed against that, and having their experience changed by bookending another work by that same composer, and changing how you hear it. Now, you had asked more specifically about how it changes performance. I believe that it changes how you listen to the work. And I can say for sure, generally, that doing contemporary music and working with composers, I felt has just been a liberating experience in general. And I don't know, I've been working with living composers for probably over 10, 15 years. And just in the lifespan of being a musician, that has been incredibly liberating to me as a musician.
Well, the Kreutzer, we might spend a couple minutes about that, because that's like a case study. So the Kreutzer was originally written, as you mentioned, for George Bridgetower, who was of mixed African and European descent. Bridgetower played this with Beethoven from Beethoven's manuscript, which is a kind of an amazing thing to imagine. If you've ever seen any Beethoven manuscripts, you know they are filled with scrawls, and they're
kind of unreadable.
Yeah, kind of unreadable. But the two got along very well, and Bridgetower did improvise during the performance occasionally, and Beethoven thought that was wonderful. We have to remember that Beethoven, when he arrived in Vienna in 1792, he was not known as a composer. He was known as a pianist who could improvise in ways that reminded people of Mozart. Mozart had just died in 1791. But Bridgetower and Beethoven had a falling out. Beethoven then dedicated it to Konradin Kreutzer, a French violin virtuoso. Kreutzer never played the piece, but his name is on it. So there's that. So now flash forward to later in the 19th century, and then we have Tolstoy writing the Kreutzer Sonata, which is a novella about a pianist and violinist having an affair. Yeah, and they're playing the Kreutzer Sonata, hence the title. And it was a novella that was considered scandalous at the time, so it was banned in the United States when it was first published. In Russia, the English translation was banned here for a while. Then we have, if we go into the 20th century, we have Janacek writing a string quartet, which is inspired by Tolstoy. So, and then we have finally Rita Dove writing a volume of poetry about Bridgetower. So these are all different generations, you know, starting back early in the 19th century and going, I think Rita Dove's is 1970s, I can't remember. But, you know, that piece has gone through so many different transformations, whether you were thinking of it from a literary angle or a musical angle, or who was meant to perform it, or who actually performed it. And every generation sort of finds its own meaning. Now, I thought that Vijay's piece was wonderful because it did use bits of material from the sonata. It did use what I heard were some West African rhythms. Maybe I'm mistaken.
No, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
So it suggested an opening up of Beethoven's piece, and to my ears, it suggested a kind of, or encouraged a kind of dialogue between the audience and this music through the lens of music of our own time, you know, recently commissioned work. So, you know, it's a brilliant stratagem. I'm just surprised it hadn't been thought of before. So maybe now talk a bit more about these sonatas. And we were talking earlier, and you were saying that, you know, when you were, the sonata originally that you were really attracted to was the 10th, Opus 96. That one really grabbed you in a way that, say, the C minor 30 number 2 did not quite. But that you were then explaining how this has all changed, having gone through this.
I mean, I think Opus 96, which is the final sonata, is still the sonata I feel closest to.
Yeah.
It was just a sonata, it was just a work of music that I just felt connected to the first time I heard it, the first time I played it. And a lot of these sonatas, you know, I've had a relationship for many, many years. And I think the relationships that I had with, for example, the Spring Sonata, Opus 30 number 2, which is the 7th sonata, Kreutzer, the 9th sonata, they were loaded with my own history. You know, I played them more as a kid, which, you know, in a weird way, all of the repertoire I've done, I mean, I went through all standard repertoire probably by the time I was 16, and standard violin repertoire. And there's kind of a weight also of performance history. There's kind of a weight to performance tradition. And I had the same thing with Bach, actually. And I really refused to play it in public for a very long time. And now I think that and from the experience of Bach, all of the things that terrify me the most have been the things that I've grown the most. And I think at a certain point when you're, let's say instrumentally, right, as a player, you're technically in a certain place. So it's not like you're going to suddenly make leaps and bounds and suddenly play 50 times faster, nor would you want to necessarily musically. And at a certain point you don't feel, you know, there's an intangibility in music, right? Because it's sound that disappears in less than a millisecond. I'm not a scientist, but, and it's really about the relationship between the sounds that makes the meaning. So I've totally lost my train of thought.
It's all right.
What was the question? Oh, the sonatas.
You were talking about Opus 96.
Oh, so I think, you know, in the end it was just about realizing that the things that scared me the most were the most rewarding, because those were obvious musical or whatever challenges. So I think what I learned from doing Bach and Beyond, and what I learned definitely from doing the marathon when I did all 6 sonatas and partitas, was that, you know, it's not, you grow the most from things like that. I think that was probably, doing the 6 sonatas and partitas in one performance, I think for the first time, that was probably the hardest thing I've ever done. And, but then, you know, and then I did Einstein on the Beach, which was also hard because I'd never done theater before, and that was terrifying. So I think that this was just felt necessary for me to do, because it was kind of the next step of what I was afraid of doing. And that a big part of that was the history of performance tradition. A big part of it was actually what had come up when my kind of advisors, when I had that conversation, because they were like, oh, you're not known as this, so people are not going to receive it, right? So, and with the understanding too that if I had been of a different race from a different country, I would be accepted immediately in a way that I would not be accepted because of who I am. But that I could actually build a stronger project because of that. And I look back at the series I kind of look back at the history of my career, and I realize as long as it might have taken me to get to this point, I actually feel lucky, because I think it made me a better artist, because I couldn't go the traditional route, right? And I wasn't accepted in traditional roles, right? As just, even coming out of the Tchaikovsky competition, I wasn't necessarily accepted as, oh, she's the next violinist. So it actually made me a much better artist in the end, because I had to think of how to get around those things, and it made me have to create individual projects that I put a lot of effort into and that I thought a lot about. And I'm actually, in the end, I'm grateful for all of whatever challenges might have come up along the way. I'm very grateful for. That was not the question. I know that wasn't the question.
It's perfectly fine. So for me, it's fascinating that you chose Beethoven. I mean, when we think of Beethoven, and we think of the classical tradition, everybody knows Beethoven or thinks they know Beethoven. But what's so special about Beethoven? Why does he grab us in the way he does? What is it about the Fifth Symphony that everybody, whether they're a classical musician or not, probably will have some response? And we were talking a bit about this. It's that Beethoven, I like to say, writes autobiographically, so that his music is a kind of record of his struggles. It's like a diary of putting together these pieces. It's like the veneer is stripped off, and you're seeing everything. You're sensing the amazing process he went through to create these masterpieces. So it's very honest music, and it's music that is very forthright, and forces us to think about things that, in other quote-unquote more polite classical music maybe we wouldn't think about. So maybe the choice of Beethoven is that it's something that gets you into a kind of zone that had you done, I don't know if you tried to do this with something else, the Mozart sonatas or...
There's too many Mozart sonatas to build a
there
project around.
Yeah.
There's too many of them. No, it's not only that. I think Beethoven is symbolic of many things. He's symbolic of this change of the role of the artist, this image of what an artist is. He, is fairly symbolic, I think, of what people imagine classical music is. And I think also at the same time, in a purely musical way, he's one of the composers where he writes his struggle in the work. You can hear him struggling with the material. You can hear him struggling to develop that material. And I think there's something, and that was revolutionary, because before that everything was very seamless. Everything was kind of hidden. All the little craggy edges were hidden. And that's not done. Beethoven does not do that. Even with Bach, and that's quite complex also, but yeah. So I think that's quite unique in Beethoven's music. And what's interesting is each composer, I think, has really engaged with the different sides of who Beethoven is in their own way. And they're addressing those different aspects of Beethoven in their own individual way. Because he means so many different things to so many people, I think.
And composers have had to deal with, their anxiety of influence has been, what do they do after Beethoven, Just as Beethoven's anxiety of influence was, if it were 1800 and he was
see, that was what was interesting, right? Because this project is around the idea of diversity. And we also sewed into this project Jörg Wiedmann, who is Germanic, who does come from a musical family, is European, obviously. And that's everything that you hear in his piece, is all the struggle of how to come to terms with the sonata form after everything historically that's been written in Western classical music. And that is not something that you hear in Vijay's work. That's not something you hear in Anthony's work. And that's not something you hear in Andrew Norman's work. Now, Anthony sounds very European avant-garde. He's Chinese-American from San Francisco. But that's his school, and that's the music he believes in writing. But what's fascinating to me, and again, I hope that this addresses the importance of adding people from different cultural backgrounds who have different relationships and points of discovery with this art form. They're not paralyzed by it. They are in fact inspired by it. And the way that their pieces have turned out are so radically different, and that's really fascinating, actually, to me.
And appropriate. I mean, that's the very nice thing about the project. Beethoven is being refracted through, you know.
But it's interesting because York's Wiedmann's piece, which is called the Summer Sonata, it is all about that struggle. Mm-hmm. And it can't not address that throughout the piece. It's just all about, you know, that struggle of what do we do now? What can I possibly now as a composer do now?
Right.
And it's kind of fascinating.
I'm just trying to think that, you know, in music history we always teach, you know, about all the symphonists. You know, few of them could get past the number 9. If you were Mahler, you know, he wrote his 9th symphony, and he wasn't ready to write number 10, so he wrote Das Lied von der Erde, you know, as sort of an interim work. And he got through that, and then he started writing his 10th symphony, and of course he died before he finished that. There is this Beethovenian, there has been this kind of vice grip on classical music, and it is time that that vice grip be loosened so that it can open up to these new interpretations. So maybe we talk a moment or two about some of the other sonatas. And here's a little fact that I find really perplexing about Beethoven. You played the Opus 12 number 1, which is the first of the 10 violin sonatas. It's the most classical. It's the one in which the young Beethoven is closest to Mozart and Haydn, and you can see him modeling the piece on classical sonata form. The last movement is a very nice classical rondo and so forth. When those pieces were published, the title page said that they were sonatas for piano or harpsichord with obbligato violin part. Mm-hmm. Now today, you know, it's incomprehensible to imagine a harpsichordist playing Opus 12 number 1 with a violinist. You know, it's just crazy. It wouldn't make sense. I mean, Beethoven is known for writing in his emphatic, bold style with all of these dynamic markings that go against the grain and sforzandi and so forth, which you cannot get on a harpsichord. But there it was, you know, in the 1790s. And then if you go to the other end of the spectrum, to number 10, your favorite, or sometimes your favorite, still your favorite, you say?
No, I think it still is. I think it might always be, actually. Yeah. I have a feeling, but I'm not sure.
It's a very special work. It's on the threshold to the late style. I like to think of it as late style. It's Beethoven becoming more abstract. It has a certain lyricism about it. There's a pastoral element to it. And then it has that, what's the adjective to describe the scherzo? I don't know. Maybe you've got one in mind, the G minor third movement.
I don't know.
After that beautiful solo movement, though, which is so incredible. And this, of course, is written at a time Beethoven is more or less completely deaf. So he is, you know, he's entering in this world of lack of sound, and he's composing based on his inner ear and on his memory of sounding music. And that changed his style radically for the late music. What I find so amazing is to get from Opus 12-1 to 96. You know, there are worlds that you're traversing, and it's not a straight trajectory. I mean, it's a kind of circuitous route. And in the middle, or toward the end, of course, is the mighty Kreutzer, you know, the violin sonata to end all violin sonatas, at least at the time, because of its technical difficulties and the audacity that Beethoven had of beginning the sonata with a violin solo, so the violin has to play the melodic line, the bass line, the inner voices all by itself. You know, that hadn't been done. Well, Bach, of course, when he's writing solo violin music, was doing that, but in Beethoven's day, I mean, that was not what people did. I guess he did that in his A major cello sonata. You know, he has the cello start by itself, but cello is just playing a few notes. What is it like psychologically for you, emotionally, musically, spiritually, to the whole cycle of the 10? You know, to go from 12-1 to 96. It's a weighty question, and there's no...
I don't know. I mean, I feel like maybe I'll know more once we, you know, for me, what I love about kind of doing these larger scale projects is this kind of idea of, and this feeling of total immersion, so that it's like I'm dropped into the life of these composers. And essentially what you want, ideally what I would want, or my goal is that they just become like a part of your DNA. It just becomes
you merge with them.
Yeah, and so having this, you know, music in my head all the time is quite satisfying. But I think more than that, it's really feeling the relationships between all of the sonatas, the moments of change, the role that each sonata plays within the larger cycle, and accepting it. Because, you know, I think when I was younger, for example, the Spring Sonata, I didn't understand why everybody loved the Spring Sonata. I was like, yes, it's pretty, okay, fine. Fine, it's lyrical, you know, what's the big deal? But within the context of all 10, it makes more sense. And the placement of it as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's that kind of total immersive experience, which is really satisfying. And it has been satisfying to be able to do all 4 in the same series in some places. So there are audience members that come to all of them. And actually the best part about it is that composers are coming. And to hear their comments, not necessarily even on the new works, but to hear their comments on Beethoven and how they're hearing it in a different way after they've heard the new works has been the most fascinating for me. That's the best part, actually, because then they are inspired to write things, and then I get presents. Which is like, I just happened to write this 20-minute piece on Bach after, you know, which is great. I mean, it's not like a present in the terms of like they're giving it to me for nothing. I mean, it's a present in terms of it's a gift because they're adding to that dialogue of music, and hopefully are inspired by the kind of programs that we're doing. So,
and probably I would imagine their own relationship to Beethoven has changed or changes.
Yeah, so it was interesting because Kaya came to Bridge to Beethoven 1, and Kaya Saariaho, a Finnish composer, came to the first program, which you guys heard here, and she was a violinist when she was younger. Her daughter's a violinist. She has her own, I think, relationship to the violin and violin repertoire, and the best thing, and I don't think she only said it because she was being nice, but you know, the best thing I could have hoped for was what she had said, which was that the Iyer completely changed how she heard the Kreutzer and how she had conceived of it. And that's the whole point of these programs, is that it changes how you experience these works that we assumed we knew, right? So it's about, for me, if I go to a concert, I would much prefer seeing somebody trying to struggle and not necessarily being entirely successful, but you can see that active transformation and you see them taking a great deal of risk to artistically reach another place. Like, that's far more interesting to me than like a perfect performance, which is in perfect taste and, you know, perfectly in tune or whatever. I want to actually be challenged. So I think hopefully that's what these programs do, is it challenges the idea, even with the older music, of what you conceive the piece to be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is about risk-taking, and it's a fantastic project on many counts. I wonder if we should pause to see if any members of the audience have questions or issues that they'd like to bring up for Jennifer to address. Just let us know. If not, we'll keep discussing a little bit. There's always, you know, with Beethoven, it's an endless topic. And for me, I mean, the main point here is that this music is not dead. It's living music. You know, it's 200 years old. It's old, and we live in a day of presentism. You know, we have our cell phones, and everything is of the second. But We're talking about music that has been moving people for 200 years, 200 plus years. That's something amazing. That's just really remarkable. Yeah, Aaron.
Just toward the question of diversity in the context of composers that you engaged, or I guess I'm sort of curious about that as a theme, and I wonder whether A, there are composers who you wanted to write for you who were not able to, and B, whether you think that the aim of diversity in the context of the project was achieved, and how, because I know you're constantly ruminating over these things, how it could be achieved better.
So what's interesting is I specifically was not going to go towards composers. You know, we came up in a time of Tan Dun and Huang Ro, where they wrote supposedly Chinese, and I'm sure they're very sincere about it, but that was definitely not what I was looking for. Was not a, I don't know what you call it, a crossover cultural dialogue or something like that. So, you know, the kind of composers we were specifically looking for were composers that were very strong creatively in a less culturally specific way, I guess, is a good way to put it. And because also that the assumption that, you know, obviously I'm coming from it as a person, as a minority, right, and as a female, and from my own experiences, where it was very difficult because there wasn't a model for me. I wasn't going to be. I remember at the beginning it was very hard for people to place me because at first they tried to place me as like the next Asian prodigy, because there was like a huge hysteria around, like, you know, after Midori and then there's Sarah Chang, there's like this like thing around Asian female prodigies, and I wasn't that, right? And then I wasn't the super pretty Asian woman with long hair that wore really attractive clothing, do you know, or whatever you call it, right? So, and that wasn't me either. I was like this short-haired Asian girl that does contemporary music, and there wasn't a model. So I think in the beginning it was very hard for people to place. I think it's gotten a little easier now, probably from my managers, because I've been doing it for a long time, but it definitely, it was not easy in the beginning. And I could see still how things came in different ways with my colleagues, and came, you know, for example, debuts would come much faster. Like, I think I'm probably, you know, once I got my foot in the door, I was like, I'm staying here. But, you know, of course, in my generation, amongst my classmates, I saw how doors were opening much faster for debuts with different places. And it might not have been a situation where they kept their foot in the door. So, you know, now maybe 10, 15 years later, I'm like more, it's a different situation. But, and I think partly, a huge part of that is how we also identify with people. Because it could be that somebody's father was a violinist, so, oh, that boy looks like my father did when he was younger, or maybe that was like my aunt. And so there's a different model. But what's fascinating to me, for example, is in the Duke University Orchestra, I would say it's 99% East Asian, and no, I'd say 98% East Asian, and then at least 1.5% Indian, and then like a couple white kids in there. So, but for example, that gives you an indication of what makeup is going to be supporting this art form in the future. So if we don't have people on stage for them also, there isn't going to be a future, because there's an identification with the people that are on that stage. Now, it doesn't mean that we lower artistic standards at all, but that there's an understanding that this world, this art form is speaking to a diverse group of people, and that the people that go on the stage have to reflect those communities as well. Was that the question? That wasn't even the question.
Well, I'm like, I don't know if I'm challenging you a little bit, but I'm sort of curious about the note. I'm curious about like what you've learned about diversity in the context of the project, and again, because I know that you're interested in what 2.0 might look like. If you were to push the idea of diversity further in the context of this Bridge to Beethoven project, what might that look like?
Well, first of all, I've never done a project without a woman composer, and this is the first project I've done without a woman composer. Second of all, I think I would have just pushed it further and not included necessarily the counterweight for the second program, which was the Summer Sonata. Because actually what's been the most rewarding, I think, musically, has been the newer work, because there's a freedom, because the whole idea behind it was exploring this evolution, and it's not stuck in necessarily the same kind of pressures.
Right, the Summer Sonata is the one that was written before you.
That was by Jörg Wiedmann, yeah. And he's a very, very successful composer, German composer, a very, very good, excellent musician, and but it's interesting to see the issues that are kind of addressed in each work. And yeah, so I think that would probably be a difference as well. And I think the other thing that could, well, I think it's not that I would fix it, but I think the next kind of projects that I'm thinking of in the future is actually engaging with like specific musical material and then having several composers write around that one segment of musical motivic material. So, because that's a more direct way of engaging, of seeing that difference, right? So like 4 programs would be is a huge commitment for any presenter to commit to, right? Especially if you only have a series of 6 recitals, let's say, in a year. So 4 is like a lot. And so how would one do that in a more concise way? And it would probably be to have like maybe motivic material that was shorter, and then have shorter pieces by composers. Yeah, engage with that shorter material. But I think I'm going to do that with something else in the future. Yeah.
There was a question over here, maybe. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Well, yes, on the Beethoven and Vijay's composition, I'm a listener. I mean, I'm not a musician, and I love Beethoven, but I failed to see any relationship between Vijay's and Beethoven. And I kind of wish we'd had the one that was struggling with the sonata form, because...
Oh, you would not have liked that piece. Because that's just so amorphous that you would have had nothing to be able to hold on to. It's very hard.
Intellectually interesting, about the Kreutzer and what inspired him, but I don't know.
Well,
I like the idea of the shorter contemporary pieces.
Well, I think what you're addressing is something that's very smart. I think Beethoven, for example, you say you love Beethoven. Beethoven is a composer we've been listening to and experiencing for decades, right? At least for me. And I know all his sonatas, I know all his language is very familiar to me. Now, if I listen to a work that I've never heard before, I might absorb 2%. If it's an especially complex work, I might absorb 1% on the first listening. So I won't necessarily hear those direct relationships right away, right? But if I spent the time studying the score, if I listened to it 5 times, if I study the score for an hour, I will start to see those relationships. I suppose it's us asking you, it's us as performers asking you to trust us that there are connections, and it's our job to try to bring those you know, motivic materials out as clearly as possible. But I think it is very understandable. I think, you know, the reason we love music is because there are many dimensions to it. It's, you know, the first time you might hear work, it might be in black and white and 2 dimensions, you know? And then the second time you hear work, you know, you might start to have color. And then you might have third time texture, fourth time maybe it's 3 dimensions. So it is understandable that on first listening, I think, that one doesn't hear all of those connections.
And I do understand the excitement within the musical community of what you're doing. And I hope maybe as I continue to listen, I will see more connection.
Yeah, I think the more you listen to those works, I think in the music community, we've heard the Beethoven symphonies, like at least, I don't know, I'd go to like thousands of times on my part at this point, even in live performance. So I think it's exciting to us because we know those works so well, and then because we know them so well, we see the relationships to these new composers, and we want to repollinate. You know, we don't want to just have Beethoven be there. We want to have, you know, pollination for this art form to continue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
This reference to the music community, it seems to be a community that the focus is your concern on classical music, but there's a larger musical community which focuses on a lot of things that I might not want to acknowledge as music, but others do. And I'm wondering what efforts you're making to create dialogue with that world. And it's out there.
Which world are you talking about, like pop music or?
Pop music, I dare say rap music, if it's music. And by saying that, I expose some of my own prejudices. I'm just wondering, what are you doing to try to expand classical into that community, but also bring some learning from that community into classical?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely crossover in terms of musical content. I think, I remember, honestly, I'm not very like pop culture like aware, and I took a car trip with one of my girlfriends, like where for 24 hours she was like, okay, we're playing everything in my teenage daughter's playlist. and I was like, what's that? What's that? I've never heard this piece. Or this piece. I've never heard that song or this whatever band. But in a weird way, I actually think that we are all connected. Obviously, classical musicians do not have the same pay grade as like, I don't know, Beyonce, right? But strangely enough, you know, I know this sounds bizarre, but I've met Jay-Z, I've met Lady Gaga, and that's, you know, I've met Kanye, and that's been through Einstein on the Beach, you know, and so there is a lot of crossover in a weird way. Like, we're not collaborating, but there's
individual people's lives crossing. Does it then have a ripple? Do you then consciously move forward with something, or?
No, it's where they're coming to the performances, and they come backstage afterwards. Although, I mean, so I'm not very pop culture, like, I mean, whatever. So I get freaked out, right, when like somebody told me they saw like the author Colin McCann, who I'm like crazy about. And like, that's what I'm just like, oh my God, can I meet him? I mean, so like my reference point of what excites me is like very different from other people, you know. And that's what like makes me freak out.
I mean, I might just offer something as someone who programs a series that goes to all kinds of musical places, which is that Jenny is making the project that she's making, and she's making the leaps in that project, or the bridges that she's making. But we have a series here where you could go and see Jenny, and then you could go and see the Chilean hip-hop artist Ana Tijoux, and then you could go and see Abdullah Ibrahim, the jazz musician. And so, in a sense, those things bump into each other in the context of a place like Duke University. or in Durham, North Carolina, in a fashion that they might not in lots of other communities. I mean, New York, they certainly would, but there's sort of such a barrage of things happening. But here there's a
curated.
A curiosity and also an opportunity and a curated.
It's highly curated. I think that's important as well.
But there's an approach that each thing can have its space and that the listener can actually, hopefully, take that voyage in a way that is comfortable for them. Or if they like to be uncomfortable and you know, sort of make those connections for themselves over the course of a season or several years.
Yeah, and in terms of directly working, I mean, Vijay Iyer is better known as a jazz pianist, right? And John Zorn is better known as a jazz musician, but he's certainly written a lot for me. And I've worked with Ornette Coleman, who's obviously passed away. So I have, you know, worked with artists that are supposedly in different forms of music, but in the end, we're actually just artists. Like, I would never say, like, to John Zorn, like, oh, you're a jazz musician. Like, that's very reductive. I would never say that to Vijay. And I don't think of them like that because they're just artists. You know, it's not that, I don't think it's that categorized.
Yeah,
I don't know if I would say that. I don't think I would say that about the Spice Girls, but I could be wrong if I were to meet them. And that really dates me.
You know, all this music is on a continuum, and it is connected. And I remember, you know, there's a quotation from Elgar. You know, we don't think of Elgar as a kind of hip composer, but Elgar said, you know, there's music all around. You simply have to take as much of it as you need. And that's very true. And this classical tradition and these various popular traditions, they are on a continuum. And they are connected, and whether it's Beethoven or Bach or any of the classical musicians, they all used the popular music of their time. And yes, it's true that today we've got hip hop over here and rap, and we have all, you know, the world's getting smaller, so all these things are colliding. But in the end, it's all music, and we're musically inclined. You know, we're all musicians to some extent, and music is one thing that every culture has. I think somebody said that music and mathematics, every culture has got those two things at least. And we tend to forget that, and we tend to worry about this classical music is way at this end and rap is way at this end. How could they possibly communicate? Well, they can, and they do, because it's a continuum. We don't always see the continuum. We miss the continuum, but it's there. Anything else? All right, well, is there one more? Yeah.
A quick question about the sequence of the program a few weeks back, when you played it at Baldwin Auditorium, where Vijay's piece was played right before the intermission, and then the second half was the Kreutzer. And just sitting in the audience, I was hearing different takes on the sequencing of the evening, how some people wanted to hear the two pieces right on top of one another, whereas others really needed or wanted that intermission to think about what they had just heard. And I'm wondering if you've ever played with the orders of these programs to see how people respond differently to that.
Well, it's a little tricky with Kreutzer, right? Because it's like 40 minutes, right? So it's really a half. So if we added Vijay's piece, that would make like a 60 plus, an hour plus for one half if we were to pair them next to each other. And it's tricky to do that. It's hard, like I don't know that people could go immediately into the sound world of Vijay's, you know, because it starts very quietly with all that extended technique in the piano. And so you want to be able to bring people to a place that they can absorb something new. And oftentimes that means, like in an orchestral concert, you'll have an overture. And so, yeah, we played around a lot with the idea of how to place things, but with the timings of the works, and we do the same thing actually with Anthony Chung's piece, because again, 10 is tricky because it's a little over but I think in a way it's good to give people that time to kind of absorb it and then kind of recenter themselves to listen to something again, in a way. But I mean, I also realize that I'm a strange outlier in the sense that I could totally sit at a concert for 4 hours if it was like compelling, and not worry about using the ladies' room because I'd probably just be glued. If it was a great performance, hopefully, right? But you need to build things so that it works for everybody.
So the question is, would you use Vijay's piece as a way to bring the audience from the present back to Beethoven, or would you, if you did it afterwards, then it would be coming from Beethoven forward? I thought your choice made sense in the practical aspect of the Kreutzer is 40 minutes. It would be. I don't think the other way would work. But I thought it was lovely the way it's it's a sort of preparatory to experiencing the Kreutzer. It's getting us back from 2015, 16 to 18, 5. So.
Yeah, and the main thing that's hard is just you never know how long they'll turn out. Also, you might ask for a 10-minute piece, and it might end up being half an hour. So you got to be careful.
Well, I'd like to thank Jennifer Koh for coming and sharing her insights into this music, and also like to thank Aaron for setting this up. And my very best wishes to you. I look forward to learning more and hearing all of your various projects. I'm sure they will take interesting turns and twists in the years to come.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.